She was 84 years old, sold tamales from her front door, and had never stood in a pulpit. But God chose her, rather than her, to show her what famous pastors don't want you to know. My name is Rosa Esperanza Villanueva, and I am 84 years old. I was born in a small town in the state of Jalisco that almost no one remembers anymore. A place where the streets were dirt and the houses had such thick walls that in the summer it felt cool inside, even though the sun outside burned like coals. My mother brought me into the world on a wooden bed with a straw mattress, assisted by a midwife who smelled of wildflowers and prayed softly as she worked. From that first day, faith was present in my life, not as a choice, but like the air, something that was simply there, that I breathed without thinking. I grew up in a family that blended what many Mexican families blend without realizing it, Christian devotion with the customs of the land. In my backyard, there was a small altar that my grandmother kept adorned with marigolds almost year-round, not just in November. The scent of copal incense was as familiar to me as the smell of bean simmering in the pot. But there was also a Bible, a thick, black-bound book with the corners already folded down before I was born. My mother read it aloud every night before bed. Even though she couldn't read perfectly, she knew it almost by heart, and where her writing faltered, her memory filled in the gaps. That's what I learned from her, that words don't need to be read perfectly to touch the heart. I married young. How did she marry then? To Aurelio? No, sorry, to Gerardo. Gerardo Castellanos, a good man with large hands and a calm voice who worked in construction and who came home every Friday with a small bouquet of flowers from the market that never cost more than 10 pesos, but which seemed to me the most beautiful gift in the world. We had 6 children, Anisn, and I raised them almost alone because Gerardo died in a construction accident when the youngest was just 3 years old. A poorly secured beam. That was it. One Tuesday afternoon, and my whole life changed direction. Oh, I didn't give up. Not because I was strong. I broke down many times. I cried a lot. There were nights when I didn't know how we were going to eat the next day. I kept going because I had no choice. Children don't wait for their mother to recover. Children are hungry, they're cold, they're scared, and their mother has to stand, even if she's broken inside. I started selling tamales. First, only on Sundays, then every day. I would get up at 4 a.m. to prepare the dough, cook the filling, fold the corn husks with my hands still numb from the early morning chill, and that's how, tamale by tamale, I raised 6 children. None of them went without shoes. None of them dropped out of school because of hunger. I'm still proud of that. Today, the years have passed, the children grew up, married, had children, and those children had children. I became a great-grandmother without realizing how all good things arrive, slowly, unannounced. My great-grandson Emilio was the one who surprised me the most. From a young age, he was different, truly studious, always asking questions that no child his age should ask. At 12, he asked his teacher what happens after death. By 16, he was already reading theology on his own. At 25, he was ordained a pastor and founded his own congregation in a neighborhood east of Guadalajara, a small place that started with 40 people. And over the years it grew to include more than 300 families. I went to see him preach once. I sat in the back row so as not to distract him and stayed silent the whole time, but inside I was crying. That boy I had held in my arms, that boy who cried as a baby if I didn't rock him. He was standing there in front of all those people talking about God with a certainty that gave me chills. It was so good. Emilio always told me I was the spiritual pillar of the family. I would tell him not to talk nonsense, that I was just an old lady who sold tamales. But he insisted, saying that since he was a child he had seen me praying in the yard before sunrise, that he had seen me open the Bible with my hands covered in flour, that he had seen me talking to God as if I were talking to someone sitting across the table. So what? He would say. It had taught him more than any seminary. By then my Bible was in a sorry state. The pages were colorless, that yellowish white that comes from years of handling, from wet fingers, from rainy nights with the window ajar. Some verses were underlined so many times, in so many different colors, that it was impossible to tell which underlining came from when. I had covered the covers myself with a scrap of flowered fabric left over from an apron. It was ugly, it was old, it was the most precious thing I owned. I had lived alone for years, but I didn't feel lonely. My house in Guadalajara was small, a single story, with an inner courtyard where bougainvillea grew in pots and a cage with 2 parakeets that never learned to talk, but made enough noise to keep the house alive. The kitchen always smelled of something, of cornla, of apazaki, of shilitadu, because I cooked, even if it was just for myself. My mother taught me that a kitchen without smell is a house without a soul. The patio walls had small cracks that I no longer even tried to fill because the bougainvillea was covering them on its own with pink and orange. It was a beautiful mess. It was my house. My granddaughters came to visit often. Tuesdays were their favorite day because I would make rice pudding and put on the radio with soft banda music. And the girls would sit in the patio telling me their problems while I listened. And every now and then I'd say something, not much. I learned over the years that people generally already know the answer to their own problems. They just need someone to be there quietly while they find it. That Tuesday in March was a day like any other. The sky in Guadalajara was that blue that only comes on mornings during the dry season, without a cloud in sight, with the sun already warm by 9 o'clock. I had gotten up early, as always. I had had my black coffee with the egg bread that the baker brought me on Mondays and had opened the Bible in the patio while the parakeets made their usual racket. I was in the book of Isaiah. I don't know why it opened there. The Bible sometimes opens by itself where it's meant to. My granddaughters Lucia and Fernanda arrived at noon. Lucia is 22 and is studying nursing. Fernanda is 19 and still doesn't quite know what she wants to do with her life, but she has a laugh that brightens any room. They arrived with bags from the market. They had bought mangoes, which I adore, and a bottle of hibiscus water that we made together in the kitchen. While they were telling me about their weeks, we sat on the patio drinking hibiscus tea with ice. The parakeets were singing. The bougainvillea was so in bloom it looked like someone had decorated it on purpose. That's when I felt the first thing. A weight. Not exactly pain, more like someone had slowly placed a large stone on my chest, without warning. I thought it was the heat. I thought it was old age. At 84, your body is always trying to tell you things, and you learn not to listen to everything it says because otherwise you'd live on nothing but worries. I kept talking, took another sip of hibiscus tea, but the weight didn't go away. It just kept getting heavier, deeper, as if it was sinking from my chest to some nameless place inside. I felt the patio move a little, not an earthquake, but something gentler, like when you get dizzy. Lucia was telling me something about university and suddenly stopped mid-sentence and asked me if I was okay. I told her yes. I think I tried to smile at her. The last thing I remember of that patio is the color of the bougainvillea, that intense pink so intense it almost hurts to look at it. And the parakeets, who suddenly fell silent, both at the same time, as if they knew something. After that, there was no more patio, no more sun, nothing more of what I knew as life. And then began what no word in Spanish, or any other language, can fully describe. I don't know how much time passed between the moment the bougainvillea lost its color and the moment I found myself staring down. Time that doesn't work like it does here. Here, time is a line, a second, then another, and you feel it passing even if you don't want it to. No, there was no line, there was something more like a still lake where everything existed at the same time without anything moving. I can't explain it any better than that. I've tried to explain it to Emilio, to my granddaughters, to everyone who asks, and I always reach the same point where words fail me, and I'm left with my hands in the air, as if pleading for someone to understand what defies description. The first thing I noticed was that I felt no pain. At 84, pain is a constant companion. my knees, my hips, my lower back, which has been complaining for years. Every time I get up from a chair, you get so used to the pain that you stop noticing it as pain. It becomes the background noise of life. That constant noise you no longer hear, but that's always there. And suddenly, that noise disappeared. Complete silence in my body, a lightness I had never felt, not even in my youth or in the best days of my life. It was as if someone had lifted a weight I'd been carrying for so long that I'd forgotten I was carrying it. That's when I looked down and saw them. I was up there. I don't know how high up it was, there was no way to measure it, but it was above the patio, floating without floating, suspended effortlessly, like a leaf on still water, and below was my body. My 84-year-old body, wearing the kitchen apron I'd put on that morning, the one with the green embroidery on the pocket, lying on the patio floor among the bougainvillea pots. One of the plastic chairs had fallen over, the fabric of my skirt tangled around one leg. The hibiscus teacup was overturned, and the red liquid was slowly spreading across the patio tiles like a stain no one was in any hurry to clean. Lucia was kneeling beside me. I could see her from above, her black hair pulled back in a high ponytail, wearing the blue blouse I'd given her for her birthday, her shoulders moving quickly because she was crying. She had my hands in hers and was squeezing them as if that could hold me back. Fernanda was standing by the patio door, the phone pressed to her ear. She was talking quickly, her voice breaking. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see the shape of her lips and the fear on her face. She dialed the emergency number, she dialed her mother's number, she dialed Emilio's number. I wanted to tell them I was okay. I wanted to go downstairs, touch Lucia's hair, tell her to let go of my hands, that she was squeezing them too tightly, but I couldn't. It was like being behind very thick glass. I could see everything perfectly, but no sound I made reached the other side and no movement I made reached the world below. I was there and yet not present and absent at the same time. The parakeets were still silent. That struck me. In all the years I'd had them, I'd never seen them stay quiet for so long. The ambulance was late. I know that because from where I was I could see the kitchen wall clock through the open door. That round clock with the dark wooden frame that I bought something at the San Juan de Dios market more than 20 years ago. The clock hands were moving, and I could see them moving, and I knew they were taking their time. The neighborhood where I live doesn't have a street with an official name in the municipal records. Delivery drivers always get lost, and so do ambulances. Fernanda had to go out onto the sidewalk to signal when she finally heard the siren in the distance, and even then she ran to the door, peeked out, shouted, and gestured with her arms so the white and red vehicle would turn at the right corner. Aaron Dos Parandas, a young man with a thin mustache, and a middle-aged woman with her hair pulled back under a cap came into the yard with the medical bag and knelt beside me with that trained efficiency they possess. People who have seen many emergencies without panic, without hesitation, doing everything in the order they've learned. The man checked for a pulse but found nothing. The woman he got the equipment out. They started chest compressions. I watched them work and thought strange things. I was thinking the patio needed sweeping, that there were dry bougainvillea leaves piled up in a corner that I hadn't collected that week. I was thinking that the rice pudding I'd planned to make for the girls was still sitting unmade in the cupboard. I was thinking about Gerardo, my husband who died more than 40 years ago, and wondering if I was going to see him. It was a calm thought, without urgency, like wondering if it's going to rain tomorrow. I didn't feel afraid. That's what I find hardest to explain when people ask me. Everyone assumes you feel terror, anguish, despair. I didn't feel any of that. I felt something more like a quiet waiting, like when you're in a doctor's office and you know the wait is going to end, but you don't yet know what the news will be. Curiosity, perhaps. That's the closest I can come. It was in that moment of calm that I began to feel something pulling me, not my body, which was still down in the patio with the paramedics on top of me. It was pulling at what I was now, at that part of me that floated and watched and thought without needing lungs to breathe or legs to support itself. It was a gentle but firm pressure, like when a river current pushes you without your having decided to move. It wasn't coming from above, it was coming from below, and not from the patio, where my body and the girls and the paramedics were. It was coming from deeper than all of that, from a place that has no direction on any map. So much bullfighting. I don't know why, it wasn't exactly fear. It was more like the instinct not to move towards something you don't know, like when as a child I would get too close to the edge of a well and something in my body would stop me before my mind could decide. That same instinct, but in something that was no longer a body. The current was stronger than my resistance. As I began to feel myself being pulled away from the patio, I caught one last glimpse below. Fernanda was kneeling now next to Lucia, both of them with their hands intertwined, praying aloud. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the shape of that prayer. It was the same one I had taught them, the same one my mother had taught me, the same one that had been passed down through generations. It was a story passed down, from woman to woman, like recipes and secrets. Seeing them together, praying over my lifeless body, was the last thing I saw of the world I knew. Sometime during those 9 minutes, Emilio received the call. He was at church preparing Wednesday's sermon, his notes spread out on the desk, a cup of coffee that had gone cold without him noticing. Fernanda called 3 times before he answered. When he heard what she was saying, he accidentally dropped his notes. He spilled his coffee without realizing it and ran out to the parking lot. He told me this later, his voice still trembling. He said that while he was speeding along the Guadalajara Ring Road, he prayed aloud in the car, not caring if other drivers heard him, not caring about anything but driving, repeating my name and God's name intertwined as if they were part of the same prayer. I knew nothing about that at the time. I was already somewhere else. The patio, the bougainvillea, the girls, the paramedics, the wooden clock in the kitchen. All of that faded away. Like a town fades away when you look at it from the back window of a bus. First you see it whole, then you see it small, then you don't see it anymore. What came next had no sunlight, no bougainvillea color, no hibiscus scent, no parakeet chirping, none of the things that had been my world for 84 years. What came next was dark, deep, and hot, and I was going into it without being able to stop, carrying only what cannot be left behind, what you become when everything else is taken away. And in that darkness, I began to hear voices. They weren't the voices of people I knew. They weren't Gerardo's voice, or my children's, or anyone in my family's. They were the voices of many people at once, speaking in Spanish, shouting in Spanish, crying in Spanish, with accents from all over, Mexican, Colombian, Venezuelan, Chilean, as if people from all over the continent were gathered in that same dark place, each in their own pain, unable to hear each other, even though they were all shouting at the same time. And the heat kept growing, not like the heat of Guadalajara in August, which is humid and heavy, but bearable. It was another kind of heat, one that didn't come from the air or the sun, but from the very walls of that place, as if the corridor I was walking through were built with something that burned from within without a visible flame, a heat that didn't burn my skin because I no longer had skin, but that reached the deepest part of what I did have, which was my soul, and squeezed it. I thought about the Bible, I thought about Isaiah, what I had been reading that morning before the girls arrived. I thought about all the nights I had read that book without fully understanding it, but believing it nonetheless. And I wondered in that dark, hot corridor, with voices from an entire continent crying around me, if all that faith had been enough. I still haven't gotten an answer. What I found was more depth, more darkness, more heat, and at the end of that seemingly endless corridor, a light that wasn't white, but red. Red like embers, red like the inside of something that had been burning for a long time, and within that light, shapes and silhouettes emerged, figures that gradually took the form of people, and then I recognized them. There are things one sees in life that cannot be unseen. One can close their eyes, try to think of something else, fill their time with activities and noise so as not to be left alone with the memory, but the image remains, etched somewhere within, where oblivion cannot reach. I have seen difficult things in my 84 years. I have seen my husband die, I have seen people go hungry, I have seen children suffer in ways a mother should never have to witness, but nothing, absolutely nothing that I have seen in this world compares to what I saw in that place. And yet, I have to tell it because they asked me to, because they brought me back for that purpose. The figures I began to make out within that red light didn't all appear at once. At first, they were shadows without precise form, outlines that the heat made tremble, like the air trembles over asphalt at midday in summer. I approached without wanting to. The current that had brought me there kept pushing me forward, without asking if I wanted to go. The ground in that place, if you could even call it ground, was dark and rough, like volcanic rock, and radiated heat from below, just as it did from above and from the sides. There was no direction that wasn't hot, no corner that didn't burn. The voices I had heard in the corridor grew clearer as I advanced. They were no longer just a chorus of mixed shouts. They began to separate, to become individual, to have different tones. There were voices that wept with that dry sob that comes when you have no more tears, but the pain remains. There were voices repeating words on a loop, like someone reciting a prayer they know is useless, yet can't stop. There were voices that simply moaned wordlessly, with that sound the body makes when suffering surpasses all language. And then the shadows took shape. The first one I recognized took my breath away, the very air I would have breathed if I'd still had lungs. He was a tall, heavy-set man with perfectly combed white hair, the way he always wore it on television. He was wearing a suit, a dark preacher's suit with a tie and everything, as if he'd just stepped down from a pulpit, but the suit was burnt at the edges, frayed, as if it had been exposed to the heat for a long time, without ever quite being consumed. His face was the face I'd seen so many times on the television screen in my living room, the face that filled auditoriums of thousands, the face that appeared in the books my children bought and placed on the bookshelf as if they were sacred objects. I'm not going to say his name, not because I'm afraid. At my age, and after what I've been through, I care very little about what people think. I'm not saying his name because Emilio asked me not to, and I listened to Emilio about that. What I can say is this man preached for decades in several Latin American countries. He had an organization based in more than one city, speaking of miracles and prosperity with a conviction that moved crowds to tears. More than once, I myself sat in front of the television, Bible in hand, listening to him, thinking that this man had a connection with God that I would never have. He was kneeling on that black rock floor. His hands, those hands I had seen raised to the sky in worship, were stretched out on the ground as if searching for something they couldn't find. His mouth moved. I got close enough to make out what he was saying. And what he was saying was the name of God, repeating it over and over with a desperation that had nothing to do with the eloquence I had known in him. It wasn't the voice of the confident, powerful preacher who filled stadiums. It was the voice of someone completely alone at the worst possible moment, without an audience, without a microphone, with no one to listen to him, because no one was listening. That was the most terrible thing. Everyone there was trapped in their own pain, locked within it, unable to communicate with those around them. It was the most absolute loneliness imaginable, surrounded by others yet no one able to reach another. He saw me. Or at least he turned his gaze in my direction. His eyes, and this is where I struggle to find words, his eyes weren't the bright, confident eyes I remembered. They were eyes that had seen far too long, the same relentless horror, eyes that had lost all hope of change, but that still held, in some deep corner, a remnant of consciousness that made him know exactly where he was and why. That was the cruelest thing of all. There was no unconsciousness, no confusion, only an absolute and unwavering clarity about his situation, with no possibility of escaping it for even a moment. He opened his mouth as if wanting to say something to me. No words came out that I could understand. I forced myself to look away, and that's when I saw the others. They weren't few, they were many, scattered in that space of red light and black rock, each in their own world of pain, each with the same expression of absolute awareness and utter despair. And I recognized several of them, not all. There were figures I didn't know, faces I couldn't place, but there were enough familiar faces for something inside me, what was left of me, to feel a jolt that wasn't physical, but felt deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. There was a man who had had a radio program in Mexico for years, a voice I'd heard in the kitchen while I made breakfast, a voice that spoke of healing and faith with a warmth that had always seemed genuine to me. He was sitting on the floor, his knees drawn up to his chest, swaying slightly, his eyes fixed on a point that didn't exist. There was a woman. It hit me especially hard to see a woman there. She had led a worship ministry that was known in several countries. She recorded songs I had sung myself at home. Beautiful songs that spoke of God's presence with an intimacy that made you feel she knew God in a special, personal way. She stood motionless, mouth agape, as if caught in a note that never quite came out. There was a young preacher, young compared to the others. He was about 50 years old, whom I had seen in videos my granddaughters showed me on their phones. A modern man, in modern clothes, who spoke the language of youth and filled theaters and convention centers. He walked in small circles, without stopping, as if movement were all he had left. And they all had something in common that took me a moment to identify. And when I did, any remaining doubts about what I was seeing vanished. They all had that same clarity in their eyes, that inescapable awareness. They all knew exactly who they were, exactly what they had done, exactly why they were there. Hell, I understood then, is not a place of confusion, but a place of perfect and permanent clarity, and that clarity is part of the torment. A creature came between them and me. I won't try to describe it in detail because every time I try, the words that come out are so inadequate that I prefer not to use them. What I can say is that it wasn't human, that its presence produced in what I was there a feeling of repulsion so intense that it was almost physical, and that it communicated something to me, not with words, but in a way more direct than words, like when music conveys an emotion without needing to explain it. It communicated that I shouldn't be seeing what I was seeing, that this wasn't my place, but that I couldn't leave yet either. It was at that moment that I began to understand, little by little, the reason those men and that woman were there. It wasn't explained to me in words at that instant. That came later with the white light. But there was something in that place that conveyed information in another way, as if the air itself, if there was air, was charged with truth. And that truth came in without one having to ask for it. What I began to understand was this: none of them had gotten there because of what they preached. They had preached the name of God, they had quoted scripture, they had spoken of love and salvation. The problem wasn't what came out of their mouths in the pulpit, the problem was what happened far from the pulpit in places where there were no cameras, no audiences, no applause. The money they took from people who didn't have enough to eat and who gave their last week's pay because they had been taught that this was faith. The families they destroyed in private, with infidelity and violence, who then confessed on Sunday with tearful eyes and microphones in hand as if public confession could erase the private damage. The young people who had come to those ministries seeking God and had instead found a system designed to extract their time, money, and devotion without giving them anything real in return. The people who had been destroyed and who had never been asked for forgiveness because admitting the harm done would have ruined the image, and the image was worth more than the person. I felt all of that there in that place of black rock and red light without anyone telling me with words, as if the ground itself were exhaling it. And what broke me the most, what made what was left of me want to get away from there, even though I couldn't help it, wasn't seeing them suffer, it was realizing that I had admired them, that I had seen those faces on television and had thought they were servants of God, that they had something special, that their success was a sign of divine blessing, that I had recommended their programs to my daughters, that I had sung those songs in my kitchen with genuine devotion, that I had felt in 26:24 compared to them, I was a lesser Christian. No talent, no platform, nothing special to offer, and now I saw them here. I stayed in that place. A time I can't measure, time there. I already said it doesn't work like here. It may have been a second, or it may have been a while, or less. I have no way of knowing. I only know that in that time I saw enough for what I believed about faith, about success in the church, about what it truly means to know God, to change in a way that has no going back. It was then that the red light began to change, not suddenly, gradually, like the sky changes when the sun begins to rise. First, barely a difference in tone, then something lighter, then something that was no longer red, but white. A white that came from no specific direction, but from everywhere at the same time. A white that didn't dazzle, even though it was more intense than any light I had ever seen. And with that light came a presence not like the creature from before, the complete opposite of the creature from before. If the creature produced repulsion, it produced something that has no exact name in any language. But it's most like arriving home after having been lost for a long time in a place that was never yours. I stood still. Or what in that place amounted to standing still and waiting for a moment in everyone's life when everything they thought they knew stops, isn't destroyed, doesn't disappear, it stops. Like when you're walking down a familiar street and suddenly there's something in the way that wasn't there before. Something that forces you to stop and really look for the first time without the automaticity of someone who already knows the way by heart. That moment came to me at 84 years old in a place that has no coordinates on any map, surrounded by a light that didn't come from any identifiable source after having seen things that even today, when I close my eyes, are there with the same clarity as the first instant. The white light didn't arrive with noise, with thunder, or with the kind of spectacle one imagines when thinking of the supernatural. It arrived like calm after a long storm, unannounced, without asking permission, simply being where it hadn't been before. And with it, the heat of that place began to subside. It didn't disappear entirely, but it receded as if the light occupied its own space and the heat had to step aside to let it pass. The voices I had heard since entering the dark corridor, that chorus of cries in Spanish from across the continent, also faded away, not because the suffering had ended, but because the light brought with it something more powerful than the sound of that suffering, and that something occupied all the remaining capacity for perception I had. The presence arrived before the voice. That's important to understand. It wasn't first a voice that then took on a presence, it was first a presence that then used a voice. And that presence was so different from everything I had felt in that place that I didn't need anyone to explain who it was. There was no doubt, there was a question. It was like recognizing the smell of your childhood home after decades of not returning. You don't need to be told where you are. The body knows before the mind, or, in my case, the soul knew before I could even form a single thought. I remained completely still, not out of fear, but out of something more akin to the profound respect one has for things greater than oneself. That respect which is not submission, but recognition. The recognition that you are standing before something that exists in a dimension beyond your grasp. And then the images came. They weren't explanations, not a voice telling me in complete sentences what had happened and why. They were images like those that flash through your mind just before falling asleep. Vivid, swift, charged with a meaning that was felt more than thought. I received them all in what we would call an instant, though the content of that instant was enough to fill years of understanding. I saw money. Bills of many denominations and many Latin American coins. Mexican pesos, Colombian pesos, bolivars, soles, quetzals, accumulated in accounts that didn't appear in any registry, hidden in properties in the names of third parties, transferred through structures that had been carefully designed with the help of people trained for that purpose. I saw those bills arrive in those accounts from the hands of people who handed them over with genuine faith. Women in the market, construction workers, elderly women on minimum pensions, young people who tithed before buying food because they had been taught that it was proof of their faith in God. I saw the gap between what those people thought they were doing with their money and what was actually being done with it. And that gap wasn't a misunderstanding, it was an architecture. It had been deliberately built, brick by brick, over years by both men and women and families, not the families.